The medic who changed everything, Sarah Martinez, had always been different from the other soldiers in her unit. While they carried rifles and heavy equipment, she carried medical supplies and hope. At 24 years old, she was small in stature, but had hands that could work miracles when someone was bleeding out on the battlefield. The other soldiers called her Doc, even though she wasn't a real doctor. To them, she was just a medic, someone who patched up cuts and handed out aspirin. The morning of March 15th started like any other day at Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Afghanistan. Sarah woke up at 0500 hours, brushed her teeth with water that tasted like metal, and checked her medical kit for the third time that week. Her supplies were running low again. The bandages were almost gone, and she only had 2 morphine injectors left. She made a mental note to request more supplies from headquarters, knowing it would take weeks to arrive. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, was a man who commanded respect without saying much. He had been in the military for over 20 years and had scars on his face that told stories of battles fought in distant lands. Harrison was the kind of leader who ate last and slept least. The soldiers loved him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But to Sarah, he was just another officer who saw her as support staff, not a real soldier. The base was located in a valley surrounded by mountains that looked beautiful but hid dangers behind every rock and tree. The local village was 3 miles away, and intelligence reports suggested that enemy fighters were moving closer to their position. Tensions had been rising for weeks, and everyone could feel that something big was coming. Sarah spent her morning in the makeshift medical tent, organizing supplies and updating medical records. Private Johnson came in with a twisted ankle from the morning run. She wrapped it carefully and told him to take it easy for a few days. Sergeant Williams stopped by to chat about his wife back home who was expecting their first baby. These small moments of human connection were what kept Sarah going during the long, lonely months of deployment. At lunch, she sat with her usual group of soldiers. They talked about home, about what they would do when their tour was over, about the letters they had received from family. Sarah mostly listened. She had joined the army to serve her country, but also to escape a life that felt too small back in her hometown in Texas. Her parents had wanted her to become a nurse at the local hospital, marry someone from church, and have babies. Instead, she chose to carry a medical bag into war zones. The afternoon brought news that made everyone nervous. Intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting a large-scale attack was being planned. Colonel Harrison called a meeting with all the senior staff. Sarah wasn't invited, of course. She was just a medic. But she could see the worried looks on the faces of the officers as they left the meeting room. As evening approached, Sarah checked her equipment one more time. She had learned early in her deployment that being prepared meant the difference between life and death. Her medical bag contained everything she might need: bandages, tourniquets, IV bags, pain medication, and surgical tools. She had practiced using every item until she could work with her eyes closed. The base was quieter than usual that night. Guards were more alert, and the usual joking around was replaced by serious conversations. Sarah tried to read a book her sister had sent her, but she couldn't concentrate. Something in the air felt different, like the moment before a thunderstorm when all the animals go quiet. Around 2100 hours, she was getting ready for bed when she heard the first explosion. It was distant but powerful enough to shake the ground under her feet. Then came the sound of gunfire. Not the practice rounds they used for training, but the sharp crack of real bullets being fired in anger. Sarah's heart started racing as she realized what was happening. The enemy had found them. Soldiers were running in all directions, grabbing weapons and taking positions. Sarah could hear Colonel Harrison's voice over the radio, calm and steady even as chaos erupted around them. He was coordinating the defense, making sure every soldier knew their job. But Sarah knew that in a few minutes her job would become the most important one on the base. She grabbed her medical bag and helmet, said a quick prayer, and ran toward the sound of gunfire. Most people run away from danger, but medics run toward it. That's what they're trained to do. As she moved through the base, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness beyond the perimeter wall. The attack was bigger than anything they had faced before. The first wounded soldier was brought to her within minutes. A young private with a bullet wound in his shoulder, bleeding heavily but conscious. Sarah worked quickly, applying pressure to stop the bleeding and starting an IV. Her hands were steady even though her heart was pounding. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at. More wounded soldiers kept coming. A sergeant with shrapnel in his leg. A corporal with a head injury. Sarah moved between them like a dancer, knowing exactly what each one needed. She had enough supplies to treat the wounded, but she could tell this battle was going to be longer and bloodier than anything they had prepared for. Outside, the fighting was getting closer to the base. She could hear Colonel Harrison's voice on the radio, requesting air support and reinforcements. But help was hours away, and the enemy seemed to know exactly where to hit them. Sarah realized that this wasn't just a random attack. Someone had given the enemy detailed information about their base. As she worked on the wounded, Sarah couldn't help but think about the irony of her situation. For months, she had been seen as just support staff, someone who wasn't really a soldier. But now, as bullets flew and explosions shook the ground, she was the one standing between her fellow soldiers and death. Her medical training was keeping them alive, one patient at a time. The night was far from over, and Sarah had no idea that before sunrise, she would do something that would change how everyone saw her forever. The small medic who was just support staff was about to become the hero who saved the most important person on the base. But first, she had to survive the longest night of her life. The explosions were getting closer, and Sarah could feel the ground shake with each blast. She had been treating wounded soldiers for 2 hours straight, and her medical supplies were running dangerously low. The small medical tent had become a lifeline for the base, with soldiers carrying their injured comrades to her one after another. Blood stained her uniform, but none of it was her own. Outside, the battle raged with an intensity that no one had expected. The enemy had surrounded the base with over 200 fighters, far more than intelligence had predicted. They had rockets, machine guns, and knew exactly where to strike. The attack was coordinated and brutal, designed to overwhelm the small American outpost before reinforcements could arrive. Colonel Harrison moved through the base like a man possessed, checking defensive positions and encouraging his soldiers. Despite the chaos around him, his voice remained calm on the radio as he coordinated their defense. Sarah could see him through the tent opening, moving from bunker to bunker, making sure every soldier had ammunition and knew their job. He was the kind of leader who led from the front, sharing the same risks as his men. The worst part of the attack came around midnight, when the enemy breached the outer perimeter. Sarah could hear the sound of close combat, soldiers fighting hand to hand in the darkness. The wounded were now coming to her faster than she could treat them. She had to make terrible decisions about who to help first, knowing that every minute could mean the difference between life and death. Private Chen arrived with a chest wound that was bleeding internally. Sarah knew he needed surgery immediately, but she didn't have the equipment or training for that kind of operation. She did what she could to stabilize him and called for helicopter evacuation. But the radios crackled with bad news. No helicopters could land while the base was under heavy fire. They were on their own. Sergeant Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite sharing the same last name, was brought in with burns covering 30% of his body. He had been caught in an explosion while trying to destroy enemy equipment that had gotten too close to the base. Sarah used the last of her burn treatment supplies on him, knowing that other wounded soldiers would need them too. Every decision felt impossible. As she worked, Sarah could hear the battle changing. The gunfire was moving closer to the center of the base, which meant the enemy was pushing through their defenses. Colonel Harrison's voice on the radio was still calm, but she could hear the strain underneath. He was asking for situation reports from positions that were no longer responding. Around 0200 hours, the lights went out. The enemy had destroyed the generator, plunging the base into darkness except for the muzzle flashes and occasional flare. Sarah continued working by flashlight, her hands moving automatically through procedures she had practiced hundreds of times. The darkness made everything more terrifying, but it also made her more focused. She couldn't see the chaos outside, only the soldier in front of her who needed her help. The sound of the battle was changing again. Sarah could hear American voices shouting orders much closer to her tent than before. The enemy had broken through the inner defenses and was fighting inside the base itself. She knew that her medical tent would soon become a target. Enemy fighters would either kill everyone inside or use the wounded soldiers as hostages. Corporal Davis stumbled into the tent carrying his rifle and bleeding from a wound in his arm. He had been fighting on the perimeter and had seen the enemy advance. "Doc, they're inside the wire," he said, using military slang for the base's defensive boundary. "We need to move these wounded soldiers somewhere safer." But there was nowhere safer to go. The base was small and the enemy seemed to be everywhere. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct she had as a medic. She handed Corporal Davis some bandages for his wound and told him to go back to fighting. She would stay with the wounded soldiers no matter what happened. The next hour was a blur of explosions, gunfire, and desperate medical care. Sarah treated a soldier who had been shot in the stomach, another who had lost 2 fingers to shrapnel, and a young private who couldn't stop shaking from shock. She was running on adrenaline and determination, knowing that these soldiers depended on her to keep them alive. Then she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, an explosion much closer than any before, followed by the unmistakable sound of the command bunker collapsing. That's where Colonel Harrison had been coordinating the defense. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Without their commanding officer, the defense of the base would fall apart quickly. A few minutes later, her worst fears were confirmed when Sergeant Williams ran into the medical tent. His face was covered in dust and blood, and his eyes showed the kind of panic that comes from seeing something terrible. "Doc, we need you outside," he said, breathing heavily. "It's the colonel. He's trapped under the rubble and he's hurt bad." Sarah looked around the medical tent at the wounded soldiers who still needed her care. Leaving them seemed impossible, but she knew that Colonel Harrison was the key to their survival. If he died, the entire base would fall to the enemy within hours. Every soldier here would either be killed or captured. She grabbed her medical bag and followed Sergeant Williams into the chaos outside. The command bunker had been hit by a rocket and had partially collapsed. She could see Colonel Harrison's legs sticking out from under a pile of concrete blocks and twisted metal. He was conscious but trapped, and blood was pooling around his head. The area around the collapsed bunker was still taking enemy fire. Bullets whistled overhead as Sarah crawled to where the colonel was trapped. She could see immediately that his injuries were serious. A piece of metal had pierced his abdomen and he had a severe head wound. But the worst part was his legs, which were pinned under concrete blocks that would take several men to move. "Don't worry about me, Doc," Colonel Harrison said through gritted teeth. "Take care of the other soldiers." But Sarah knew that wasn't an option. The colonel was the heart of their defense. Without him, the base would fall and everyone would die. She had to find a way to get him out of there and keep him alive. The problem was that moving him would require help from other soldiers, and all of them were busy fighting for their lives. As she worked to stop his bleeding and stabilize his condition, Sarah realized that the situation was about to get much worse. The enemy was closing in on their position, and soon there would be no safe place left on the entire base. Sarah knelt beside Colonel Harrison in the rubble, her hands working quickly to assess his injuries while bullets continued to fly overhead. The metal fragment in his abdomen was serious but not immediately life-threatening, if she could control the bleeding. The head wound looked worse than it was, but his legs were the real problem. The concrete blocks pinning him down were too heavy for her to move alone, and she could see that his left leg was badly broken. "How bad is it, Doc?" the colonel asked, his voice steady despite the pain. Even trapped and wounded, he was still thinking like a commander, still worried about his soldiers. "You'll live, sir." "But we need to get you out of here," Sarah replied, though she had no idea how that was possible. The enemy was closing in from 3 sides, and the remaining American forces were falling back to a smaller defensive perimeter. Soon, this position would be overrun. Sergeant Williams appeared beside her, keeping low to avoid the gunfire. "Doc, we've got to go. The captain is ordering everyone to fall back to the communications building. It's the only place left we can defend." Sarah looked at the concrete blocks trapping Colonel Harrison. "Help me move these," she said. Williams shook his head. "It would take 4 men to lift those blocks, and we don't have 4 men. We barely have enough soldiers left to hold the communications building." The terrible reality of the situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. They were being forced to choose between saving one man and saving everyone else. Military doctrine was clear in situations like this. You don't risk many lives to save one person, even if that person is your commanding officer. "Leave me," Colonel Harrison said, understanding what was happening. "That's an order, Doc. Get to safety and take care of the other soldiers." But Sarah had made her decision before he finished speaking. She couldn't leave him to die alone in the rubble. More than that, she knew that without the colonel's leadership, the remaining soldiers wouldn't be able to organize an effective defense. He was their best hope of surviving until reinforcements arrived. "I'm not leaving you, sir," she said firmly. "Sergeant Williams, go to the communications building. Tell Captain Torres that I'm working on getting the colonel out. We'll catch up as soon as we can." William stared at her in disbelief. "Doc, that's suicide. You can't move those blocks by yourself, and the enemy will be here in minutes." "Then I guess I better work fast," Sarah replied, already examining the concrete blocks to see if there was a way to shift them without heavy equipment. After Williams left, Sarah was alone with the colonel in the ruins of the command bunker. The sound of battle was getting closer, and she could hear enemy voices shouting orders in a language she didn't understand. She estimated that she had maybe 10 minutes before they would be discovered. The concrete blocks were arranged like a house of cards, with the weight distributed across several pieces. Sarah realized that if she could move one key block, the others might shift enough to free the colonel's legs. The problem was that the key block weighed at least 200 pounds and was wedged against a piece of twisted metal. She found a metal rod in the rubble and used it as a lever, positioning it under the corner of the block. The physics were against her. She weighed only 125 pounds and was trying to move something almost twice her weight. But desperation gave her strength she didn't know she had. "Doc, what are you doing?" Colonel Harrison asked, trying to turn his head to see her work. "Shut up and let me concentrate," Sarah replied, putting all her weight on the makeshift lever. The block shifted slightly, but not enough to free his legs. She repositioned the lever and tried again, this time using her entire body as counterweight. The concrete block moved another inch, and she heard the colonel gasp as pressure was relieved from his legs. But they still weren't free, and she could hear footsteps approaching through the rubble. Sarah grabbed her pistol with one hand while continuing to work the lever with the other. She wasn't trained for combat like the infantry soldiers, but every American soldier knew how to use a weapon. If the enemy found them, she would fight while continuing to try to free the colonel. The footsteps got closer, and Sarah held her breath. But instead of enemy fighters, she saw Private Chen crawling through the rubble toward them. He was the soldier she had treated earlier for a chest wound, and he should have been evacuated with the other wounded. "Private, what are you doing here?" she whispered. "Heard you were trying to move the colonel," Chen replied, breathing heavily from the exertion of crawling through the debris. "Figured you could use some help." Despite his chest wound, Chen added his strength to hers on the lever. Together, they managed to shift the concrete block enough to free one of the colonel's legs. But the other leg was still trapped, and now they could hear enemy voices much closer than before. "We need to go now," Chen said urgently. "I saw at least 6 fighters moving this way." Sarah looked at the colonel's remaining trapped leg and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She pulled out her medical saw, a small but sharp tool designed for cutting through bone during amputations. "What are you doing?" Colonel Harrison asked, seeing the saw in her hand. "I'm sorry, sir, but it's your leg or your life," Sarah replied, positioning the saw just above his ankle where the concrete had crushed the bone beyond repair. Colonel Harrison understood immediately. He had seen enough battlefield injuries to know that his foot was already destroyed. "Do it," he said simply. Sarah had never performed an amputation in the field, but she had studied the procedure. She worked as quickly as possible while Private Chen kept watch for enemy fighters. The colonel bit down on a piece of rubber from her medical kit and didn't make a sound, even as she cut through bone and tissue. The entire procedure took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. When she finished, the colonel's leg was free, but he had lost his foot. Sarah applied a tourniquet to stop the bleeding and wrapped the wound as best she could with her remaining supplies. "Can you move, sir?" she asked. Colonel Harrison tried to sit up but immediately became dizzy from blood loss. "I don't think I can walk," he admitted. Sarah looked at Private Chen, who was still watching for enemy fighters. His chest wound was bleeding again from the exertion of helping her. She had 2 wounded soldiers and no way to get them to safety. The communications building was over 2 miles away, and the enemy controlled most of the ground between here and there. That's when Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her military career. If they couldn't walk to safety, she would carry them. Sarah stared at Colonel Harrison and Private Chen, both wounded and unable to walk. The enemy voices were getting closer, and she could see flashlight beams moving through the rubble of the destroyed command bunker. In a few minutes, they would be discovered, and all 3 of them would either be killed or captured. She had carried wounded soldiers before during training exercises, but those were healthy men pretending to be injured over short distances. This was different. Colonel Harrison weighed nearly 200 pounds, and she would have to carry him over 2 miles of dangerous terrain while enemy fighters were actively hunting them. "Doc, "Leave me and take Chen," the colonel whispered. "He's got a better chance of surviving than I do." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not leaving anyone behind." She had made that promise to herself when she became a medic, and she wasn't going to break it now. Private Chen tried to stand up to help, but his chest wound had reopened and he was breathing with difficulty. "I can make it on my own," he said, though they all knew that wasn't true. Sarah quickly assessed their situation. The communications building was northeast of their position, but the most direct route was completely controlled by enemy forces. She would have to take a longer path that went around the base perimeter and through the surrounding hills. The terrain was rocky and difficult, but it offered more places to hide. She helped Private Chen onto her back first, securing him with straps from her medical kit. He wasn't as heavy as the colonel, and his wound was stabilized for now. "Hold on tight and don't make any noise," she told him. The journey to get Chen to safety took 45 minutes of crawling, hiding, and carefully moving through the darkness. Sarah used every piece of cover she could find, from destroyed vehicles to concrete barriers. Twice they had to freeze completely still, while enemy patrols passed within feet of their hiding spots. When they finally reached a position where American soldiers could provide covering fire, Sarah was exhausted and her muscles were cramping, but Chen was alive and would survive his injuries. The soldiers at the communications building were amazed to see her emerge from the darkness with a wounded comrade on her back. "Doc, how did you get through the enemy lines?" Captain Torres asked as medics took Chen from her shoulders. "Very carefully," Sarah replied, already thinking about her return trip. "I need to go back for Colonel Harrison." Captain Torres grabbed her arm. "Absolutely not. It's a miracle you made it here once. Going back is suicide." But Sarah had already made up her mind. "The colonel is still alive, and I'm not leaving him out there." She checked her remaining medical supplies and prepared for the most dangerous mission of her life. The return journey was even more difficult because Sarah knew that the enemy would be expecting someone to come back for the colonel. They had probably found his location by now and were using him as bait to capture more American soldiers. Sarah would have to be smarter and more careful than she had ever been before. She took a different route back, one that was longer but offered better concealment. The rocky terrain was hard on her boots and she had to move slowly to avoid making noise. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter, and every sound could give away her position. When she finally reached the collapsed command bunker, she found Colonel Harrison exactly where she had left him. But now there were 3 enemy fighters standing guard nearby, talking quietly and smoking cigarettes. They had indeed found him and were using him as bait. Sarah studied the situation from her hiding spot behind a destroyed vehicle. The guards were relaxed, confident that no one would be foolish enough to attempt a rescue. One of them was facing away from the colonel, while the other 2 were sitting on some rubble about 20 feet away. She would have only one chance to get this right. If she made any noise or if the guards spotted her, both she and the colonel would be captured or killed. Sarah checked her pistol and made sure her medical equipment was secured so it wouldn't rattle. Moving like a shadow, she crept closer to the colonel's position. The guard who was facing away from her was the closest threat, standing only 10 feet from where Harrison lay in the rubble. Sarah would have to eliminate him silently before the other 2 guards noticed anything was wrong. She had never killed anyone before. All her training had been focused on saving lives, not taking them. But she knew that the colonel's life, and possibly the lives of all the soldiers in the communications building, depended on what she did in the next few minutes. Sarah moved to within arm's reach of the guard, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The man was young, probably not much older than she was, and for a moment she hesitated. Then she thought about all the American soldiers who had died that night, and her resolve hardened. She struck quickly and silently, using techniques she had learned in basic training but never thought she would need to use. The guard dropped without making a sound, and Sarah immediately began moving toward the colonel. The other 2 guards were still talking and hadn't noticed anything wrong. But Sarah knew she only had minutes before they would check on their companion. She reached Colonel Harrison and whispered in his ear, "We're leaving now." The colonel was weaker than before, having lost more blood during the hours she had been gone. But he was still conscious and alert. "How many guards?" he whispered back. 2 left, about 20 feet away," Sarah replied, positioning herself to lift him onto her back. Colonel Harrison was much heavier than Private Chen, and his injuries made it difficult to position him safely. Sarah had to use all her strength just to get him onto her shoulders, and she immediately felt the strain in her back and legs. Carrying him 2 miles would push her body beyond its limits. But as she began to move away from the guard post, carrying her commanding officer through the darkness, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. Despite the danger and exhaustion, despite the weight on her shoulders and the pain in her muscles, she felt proud of who she was and what she was doing. She was no longer just a medic. She was a soldier saving her fellow soldier, and nothing else mattered. 2 miles of hell. Sarah's shoulders screamed in pain as she carried Colonel Harrison through the rocky terrain. Every step was agony, and the weight of his body seemed to increase with each passing minute. They had been moving for only 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. She still had over 1.5 miles to go. The colonel was drifting in and out of consciousness due to blood loss. Sarah could feel his blood seeping through her uniform where his wounded abdomen pressed against her back. She knew that if she didn't get him to proper medical care soon, he would die regardless of whether they made it to safety. Behind them, she could hear shouts and gunfire as the enemy discovered the dead guard and realized their prisoner was gone. Flashlight beams swept across the landscape as search teams spread out to find them. Sarah knew that her route was no longer secret, and enemy fighters would soon be following her trail. "Doc," the colonel whispered weakly. "Put me down. You can't carry me much further." Sarah gritted her teeth and kept walking. "With respect, sir, shut up and let me do my job." The terrain was getting more difficult as they moved into the hills surrounding the base. Loose rocks shifted under Sarah's feet, and several times she nearly fell while navigating steep slopes with the colonel on her back. Her medical training had taught her about the limits of human endurance, and she knew she was approaching hers. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and her breathing was becoming labored. The straps securing the colonel to her back were cutting into her shoulders, and she could feel blisters forming on her feet inside her boots. But she kept moving because stopping meant death for both of them. The enemy search teams were getting closer. Sarah could hear voices calling to each other in the darkness, coordinating their hunt. They had vehicles now, probably trucks that could move faster across the rough terrain than she could on foot. Time was running out. She reached a small valley between 2 hills and realized she had made a mistake. The route she had chosen was taking her through an area with no cover, where the enemy could easily spot them. But going back would mean losing precious time and energy she didn't have. "I can hear engines," Colonel Harrison said, more alert now as adrenaline fought against his blood loss. "They're using vehicles to cut off our escape routes." Sarah could hear them too. At least 2 trucks, maybe 3, moving parallel to her position. The enemy was smart enough to know that she couldn't carry the colonel very fast, and they were positioning themselves to intercept her before she could reach safety. She changed direction, heading toward a cluster of large rocks that would provide some concealment. But the detour would add at least 30 minutes to their journey, and Sarah wasn't sure she had 30 minutes of strength left. As they reached the rocks, the colonel's weight suddenly shifted and Sarah stumbled. She managed to keep her balance, but barely. Her body was reaching the point where muscle fatigue would overcome willpower, and when that happened, she would collapse. "Doc, listen to me," the colonel said urgently. "I can see vehicle headlights about half a mile behind us. They're going to catch up soon." Sarah looked back and saw the lights moving in their direction. The enemy had found their trail and was closing the distance rapidly. She estimated maybe 10 minutes before the vehicles would reach their position. "There's a steep ravine about 200 yards ahead," she said, remembering the terrain maps she had studied. "If we can reach it, the vehicles won't be able to follow us down." But 200 yards might as well have been 2 miles given Sarah's condition. Her legs were cramping and every muscle in her body was screaming for rest. The colonel was getting heavier with each step, and she could feel her grip on his legs starting to slip. They reached the edge of the ravine just as the vehicle headlights crested the hill behind them. Sarah looked down into the darkness and realized that climbing down while carrying the colonel would be nearly impossible. The slope was steep and covered with loose rocks that would make footing treacherous. "We're going down together," she told the colonel. "If we fall together." She began the descent slowly, testing each step before putting her full weight down. The loose rocks shifted constantly under her feet, and twice she had to grab onto scrub brush to keep from falling. The colonel remained silent, understanding that any movement or noise could send them both tumbling down the hillside. Halfway down the ravine, Sarah's strength finally gave out. Her legs buckled and she fell forward, landing hard on her knees while the colonel rolled off her back. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't even think. Every part of her body hurt, and she wanted nothing more than to lie down and rest. But the vehicle engines were getting louder above them, and she could see flashlight beams starting to probe the ravine. The enemy had reached the top and would start climbing down soon. Colonel Harrison was conscious but in bad shape. The fall had reopened his abdominal wound and fresh blood was spreading across his uniform. "Doc, I'm done," he said quietly. "Save yourself?" Sarah looked at him lying there in the darkness, this man who had led them all with such courage and determination. She thought about all the soldiers who looked up to him, who depended on his leadership to survive. She thought about his family back home who were waiting for him to return. Then she thought about what she would tell them if she came back alone. "No," she said simply, getting back to her feet despite the pain. "We're both going home." She pulled the colonel back onto her shoulders, using the last reserves of strength she didn't know she still had. Her body was running on pure determination now, fueled by something deeper than physical endurance. The bottom of the ravine was only 50 yards away, but it might as well have been on the moon. Sarah took one step, then another, moving like a machine whose batteries were almost dead but still functioning. Behind them, she could hear the enemy fighters beginning their descent into the ravine. 20 yards from the bottom, Sarah's vision started to blur from exhaustion. 10 yards away, she stumbled but didn't fall. 5 yards from safety, she heard gunshots as the enemy spotted them in the darkness. That's when the miracle happened. American voices called out from the bottom of the ravine, and suddenly the darkness was filled with the muzzle flashes of friendly weapons providing covering fire. A rescue team had come looking for them. The rescue and recognition. The rescue team at the bottom of the ravine consisted of 6 American soldiers led by Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a veteran special operations medic who had volunteered to search for Sarah and the colonel. They had been tracking her route for over an hour, following the trail of blood and disturbed ground that marked her incredible journey. "Cover fire! Cover fire!" Rodriguez shouted as his team engaged the enemy fighters descending from the top of the ravine. The darkness erupted with gunfire as American and enemy forces fought for control of the narrow space. Sarah's legs finally gave out completely as she reached the bottom of the ravine. She collapsed forward and the colonel rolled off her back onto the rocky ground. For a moment she couldn't move or speak. Every muscle in her body had been pushed beyond its breaking point, and she felt like she might pass out. Rodriguez appeared beside her, checking both her and the colonel for injuries. "Doc, you did good," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Real good, but we need to move now before more enemy fighters show up." 2 soldiers lifted Colonel Harrison onto a stretcher, while another helped Sarah to her feet. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand, but she refused to be carried. "I can walk," she insisted, though every step was agony. The rescue team moved quickly through the bottom of the ravine, using night vision equipment to navigate in the darkness. Behind them, the gunfire continued as the enemy fighters tried to follow their path down the steep slope. But the American soldiers had the advantage of better equipment and training, and they were able to keep the enemy at a distance. Colonel Harrison drifted in and out of consciousness during the evacuation. When he was awake, his eyes kept finding Sarah, as if he couldn't believe what she had done. "Doc," he whispered during one lucid moment, "you saved my life." "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied, though they both knew it was much more than that. The journey back to the communications building took 30 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime to Sarah. Her body was shutting down from exhaustion and she was running on pure willpower. Several times soldiers offered to carry her, but she refused each time. She had carried the colonel 2 miles through enemy territory, and she was going to walk back under her own power. When they finally reached the American defensive perimeter, word of Sarah's rescue mission had already spread among the surviving soldiers. As she walked through the entrance to the communications building, every soldier they passed stopped what they were doing to stare. Some nodded with respect, others saluted, but all of them looked at her differently than they had before. Captain Torres met them at the entrance, his face showing a mixture of relief and amazement. "Martinez, I can't believe you pulled it off," he said. "When you didn't come back after 2 hours, we thought you were both dead." Sarah was too exhausted to respond properly. She just nodded and asked, "How's Private Chen?" "He's stable. The medics patched him up and he'll make a full recovery, thanks to you." Colonel Harrison was immediately taken to the improvised medical station, where military doctors worked to stabilize his condition. His abdominal wound required surgery, and he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. Sarah finally allowed herself to sit down on a wooden crate, and the full impact of what she had done began to hit her. She had carried a 200-pound man over 2 miles through enemy territory, fought off enemy fighters, and saved the life of her commanding officer. 3 hours ago, she had been just a medic. Now she was something else entirely. The other soldiers in the communications building kept glancing at her with a new kind of respect. Word of her rescue mission spread quickly through the defensive perimeter, and soon every American soldier on the base knew the story. The small medic who had been overlooked and underestimated had become the hero of the night. But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt exhausted, scared, and overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Her hands were shaking as the adrenaline wore off, and she couldn't stop thinking about the enemy fighter she had killed. She had crossed a line that night, moving from someone who saved lives to someone who had taken one. Sergeant Rodriguez sat down beside her, offering her a bottle of water. "You know, Doc, I've been in special operations for 12 years and I've never seen anything like what you did tonight." "I just couldn't leave him," Sarah said quietly. "Most people would have. Most people would have said it was impossible and walked away. But you didn't." Rodriguez paused, looking at her with genuine admiration. "You know this is going to change everything for you, right? Word of what you did tonight is going to travel all the way back to the Pentagon." Sarah hadn't thought about that. She had been focused entirely on the immediate crisis, not on any long-term consequences. The idea that her actions might have broader implications was overwhelming. As dawn approached, reinforcements finally arrived at the base. Helicopter gunships provided air support while a full battalion of infantry secured the area. The enemy fighters who had attacked the base melted away into the surrounding hills, their assault finally defeated. Colonel Harrison was evacuated to a field hospital where surgeons worked to repair the damage from his injuries. Before the helicopter took off, he insisted on speaking to Sarah one more time. "Martinez," he said, his voice weak but clear, "what you did tonight was extraordinary. I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." "Thank you, sir, but I was just doing my job." Colonel Harrison shook his head. "No, Doc, you went far beyond your job. You saved my life and you saved this entire base. Without my coordination, our defense would have collapsed within hours. Every soldier who survived tonight owes their life to you." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying the colonel to safety, Sarah stood on the landing pad watching it disappear into the morning sky. Around her, the base was slowly returning to normal as soldiers began the process of assessing damage and treating the wounded. But Sarah knew that nothing would ever be normal for her again. She had proven something to herself and to everyone else that night. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She was a soldier who had faced the impossible and found a way to succeed. The recognition would come later, medals, commendations, and a reputation that would follow her for the rest of her military career. But standing there in the dawn light, exhausted and overwhelmed, Sarah felt something more important than recognition. She felt proud of who she had become. The legend lives on 6 months after the battle at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Sarah Martinez stood in the Pentagon briefing room wearing her dress uniform, decorated with ribbons and medals she never thought she would earn. The silver star on her chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of valor that placed her among the most decorated soldiers in the military. The ceremony that morning had been attended by generals, politicians, and journalists from around the world. Sarah's story had become legendary within military circles and had captured the attention of the American public. She was no longer just a medic from a small town in Texas. She had become a symbol of courage and determination that inspired people everywhere. But fame wasn't what Sarah had been looking for when she joined the Army. Standing in that briefing room, surrounded by high-ranking officers who wanted to hear her story firsthand, she felt uncomfortable with all the attention. She had done what needed to be done to save her fellow soldiers, nothing more and nothing less. Colonel Harrison had recovered from his injuries, though he would walk with a prosthetic foot for the rest of his life. He had been promoted to full colonel and given command of a training facility where he was revolutionizing how the military prepared medics for combat situations. His first act in his new position had been to recommend Sarah for promotion and assignment to his facility. "The thing people don't understand about heroes," Harrison told the assembled officers, is that they don't set out to be heroes. They just refuse to give up when everyone else would. Sergeant Martinez didn't carry me 2 miles because she wanted glory. She did it because leaving me behind was unthinkable to her. Sarah had been promoted to sergeant and was now training other medics in advanced battlefield rescue techniques. Her experience at FOB Phoenix had been studied by military strategists and turned into training scenarios used throughout the armed forces. But she insisted that the focus should be on the techniques, not on her personal story. The other soldiers from that night had all survived their injuries. Private Chen had made a full recovery and had requested transfer to Sarah's training unit. He wanted to learn from the woman who had saved his life and help her teach others. The bond formed during that terrible night had created friendships that would last a lifetime. During her training sessions, Sarah emphasized that anyone could do what she had done if they had the proper preparation and mindset. Heroism isn't about being superhuman, she would tell new medics. It's about being prepared, staying calm under pressure, and never giving up on your fellow soldiers. But the reality was that what Sarah had accomplished was extraordinary by any measure. Military analysis showed that carrying a 200-pound man over 2 miles of hostile terrain should have been physically impossible for someone of her size and build. Yet she had done it through a combination of technical skill, mental toughness, and sheer determination. The story had inspired changes throughout the military. Physical fitness standards for medics were revised to include more functional strength training. New equipment was developed to make battlefield evacuations easier. Most importantly, the perception of medics within the military had fundamentally changed. No longer were they seen as support personnel who stayed safely behind the lines. Sarah's example had proven that medics were warriors who would fight as hard to save lives as infantry soldiers fought to take them. The phrase "just a medic" had been eliminated from military vocabulary. A year after the battle, Sarah received a letter that meant more to her than all the medals and recognition combined. It was from Colonel Harrison's daughter, a college student who had written to thank Sarah for bringing her father home. "I don't know how to express what you mean to our family," the letter read. "My dad tells everyone about your courage, but I think what impressed him most was your refusal to leave anyone behind. That's the kind of soldier I hope to be someday." Colonel Harrison's daughter had enlisted in the Army and was training to become a medic herself, inspired by Sarah's example. She wasn't the only one. Recruitment for military medical positions had increased dramatically since Sarah's story became known, with young people across the country choosing to serve as medics because they wanted to make the same kind of difference Sarah had made. Sarah often wondered what would have happened if she had made different choices that night. What if she had followed orders and retreated to safety? What if she had decided that saving one person wasn't worth risking her own life? The answer was always the same. She would never have been able to live with herself. The lesson that emerged from her story wasn't about individual heroism, but about the power of refusing to accept defeat. Sarah had faced an impossible situation and had found a way to succeed. Because giving up wasn't an option, that mindset, more than any physical capability, was what had made her extraordinary. During a television interview on the anniversary of the battle, Sarah was asked what she wanted people to remember about her story. Her answer surprised the interviewer. "I want people to remember that this wasn't about me," she said. "This was about a group of soldiers who faced overwhelming odds and refused to quit. Colonel Harrison led us with courage even while wounded. Private Chen fought through his injuries to help with the rescue. The soldiers at the communications building held their position against impossible odds. Everyone that night was a hero, but the interviewer pressed her on her own role. "Sergeant Martinez, you carried a man twice your weight for 2 miles through enemy fire. That's not something most people could do." Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "Most people never find out what they're capable of because they never face a situation that demands everything they have. I was lucky enough to discover that I could do more than I thought possible. But I believe that capability exists in more people than we realize." Today, Sarah Martinez continues to serve in the military, training the next generation of combat medics. Her techniques and philosophy have influenced medical training programs around the world, but she still sees herself as just a soldier doing her job, someone who refuses to leave fellow soldiers behind. The phrase "just a medic" is now used ironically in military circles, a reminder that support roles can become combat roles in an instant, and that courage can emerge from the most unexpected places. Sarah's story has become part of military legend. taught in academies and training facilities as an example of what's possible when someone refuses to accept the impossible. But for Sarah, the real reward isn't the recognition or the legend that has grown around her name. It's the knowledge that Colonel Harrison went home to his family, that Private Chen recovered from his wounds, and that the soldiers at FOB Phoenix survived a night that should have killed them all. She was never just a medic. She was a soldier who understood that her real mission wasn't just to heal the wounded, but to make sure everyone came home alive. And on one terrible night in Afghanistan, she proved that sometimes one person's refusal to give up can change everything.